When I started out in real estate, I had a vision for what a real estate investor looked like. I remember reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad and envisioning myself, like Robert Kiyosaki, sitting at a table with my CFO, my attorney, my project manager, and my accountant. I wanted to be at the head of that table, and I wanted to get there immediately. I found a real estate agent as my first advisor. With his help, I found a house, I purchased it, and then I hired a GC to do all the work. My plan was working. Fast forward several months. I was out of money, my project looked nothing like I had envisioned, and all my advisors had left the table. To get out of this mess, I had to sell my truck, rent out the property that I was living in, and sleep in a sleeping bag on the job site until I finished the rehab with my own two hands. I had built a house on a weak foundation, no pun intended. Although I thought I knew where I wanted to go as a real estate investor, the truth is I had no clue where I was at or where I wanted to go. The problem is, I didn't take my current level into consideration at all. I just went full steam ahead. It took me having to start over and work through all the different levels of being an investor before I finally realized where I wanted to go and how to get there. So don't make the same mistakes that I did. Learn to recognize what level you're at and how to get to the next step. Now, there's no real right answer to this question, but I'm going to try to give you the best answer anyway. So here are the steps that I went through. Stage 1, the DIYer. As I mentioned before, I would sleep in sleeping bags on the job site, and at some point I upgraded and bought a slide-in camper that I'd put in the backyard of every house that I bought. I did that for the better part of a decade. At that point, I was much more concerned with every dollar I spent versus every hour I spent. And with each project that I would take on, I would gradually increase the size of the job. These projects took me forever because basically every 3 days looked like this. Day 1, go through the code book, try to do what I thought needed to be done on the project. Day 2, realize all that was wrong and I had to tear it all out. Day 3, usually I'd do it right. And through this process, I eventually learned how to build some pretty fancy stuff. The problem was, I didn't want to be a contractor or a handyman. The last project I did with my own two hands took me 550 16-hour days straight. I missed 2 Christmases. Now, I had created a pretty lucrative job for myself and I put quite a bit of cash in my pocket, but I had to find a way to get ahead. What is it? A DIYer who does all the work with their own two hands. Now, he or she may hire professional tradesmen like electricians, plumbers, HVAC, or other special trades, especially if they require a license or a permit. Who are these guys? Well, a DIYer usually sources the deals on their own, perhaps with the help of a real estate agent or a wholesaler. Sometimes they find deals on their own, but that's pretty rare because they're busy doing all the work. Often, they're a newcomer to the game. Maybe a blue-collar guy turned investor. Note the quotes here because it's not really investing unless you're holding long-term. The pros. Actual costs will be very low. Check out my video on the real costs. You have maximum control over the project and the deal. You'll learn how things actually get built and it makes you a better manager. You have a closer relationship with the tradesmen you do end up hiring. The cons. You can really only complete a couple of jobs per year. The income you make is only enough to replace your day job. It's a total bandwidth thief. It has an end. Eventually you'll be too old to do this stuff. And it's hard to acquire rentals because you need the income from flipping and you can only do so many projects at one time. When you stop, the money stops. Stage 2, the foreman. After getting those skills and experience under my belt, I felt like I had the confidence to go out and hire my own crew and manage them myself. And so I bought my next flip house and I went out recruiting. At first, I started with a 4-man crew. I'd go to the job site and work side by side with the guys. And soon that crew grew to 10. And I figured out that that's way too many guys for one rehab project. So I decided I'd take on other projects. More projects meant that I had to spread my crew around and I could no longer be on the job site with them. That is when the real issues started. I ended up spending most of my time problem solving and paying for mistakes that these guys caused across multiple projects. And eventually I started thinking, gosh, I should just go and do this myself again. But at the time, I didn't have the guts to let these guys go. So I watched all my earnings that I had made as a DIY flipper basically go to zero, to the point where I couldn't do it anymore. And that's when came what I call Bloody Friday. I called all the guys to the job site, I gave them their final paychecks, And for me, it was back to the drawing board. What does it mean? A foreman hires a crew of W-2 workers, or they use a staffing company, and they lead that crew from the ground. Who are these people? Well, a foreman is usually the next step from a DIYer. He or she has learned enough, or they already knew enough about how to complete a rehab project and is able to manage others to do that work. The pros. Actual costs on a project can be lower if you can manage effectively. You have control over the workforce and the priorities. You can work on multiple projects at one time. You can free up your bandwidth to focus on other things. You can even take short time off breaks. And you can give great people great jobs. The cons. Any mistake you make will be on your own dollar. Management will eat up your bandwidth. You'll have to do a lot of training and vision casting. You'll always have to be thinking about where the next job is and make sure you have future projects lined up for them. Unless you're an a-hole and you don't really care about the guys not having work some days. Your overhead costs will be much higher. You'll have to flip more houses to make sure you cover your W-2 employee costs, your insurance, taxes, etc. Stage 3, the MIYer, the manage it yourselfer. After my experience as a foreman, I figured out the weekly tap of payroll was not the way to do this. There had to be a better way than being a slave to the constant outflow of money. So I decided that I needed to find subcontractors for every trade, and I would give them a predetermined price, and I'd sit back and wait for the project to be done. In theory, this was great, but in practice, it was nothing but. It seems that every job that was finished had all kinds of loose ends that I had to tie up. Since there were multiple contractors on a job, there were always fingers to point at another guy. And so it was always that I needed to clean up the loose ends myself or pay somebody to do it. I still remember the project that was the breaking point for me. It was completely done. I was doing my final walkthrough. I turned the shower on upstairs and it started raining in the kitchen right below it. I had to go as far as opening up the tile wall to assess the problem. Now, normally, a leak in a pipe is not that big a deal. What had happened is a screw from the concrete board went through the pipe. But what I found inside the wall is what broke me. And that is the repair that was done was duct tape. That's when I realized that my newest strategy had a huge gap in accountability. What is it? The MIYer plays the part of general contractor, planning out the scope of work, recruiting and hiring subcontractors, setting expectations, and holding accountability. Who are they? Well, the MIYer is typically a more experienced investor who understands the game of investment and rehabs. Pros. The actual cost will vary depending on the level of subcontractor you hire. Some will be cheaper and they'll require more oversight. Some will be more expensive and maybe require none. Your project count only depends upon your ability to manage and recruit subs. Once you have systems in place, you can expand rapidly or even hire a team to manage. You can stop and start your business at will unless you have a team in place. You have the ability to really work on your business instead of in your business. The cons, you'll have to become great at setting expectations. You'll have to have hard conversations when expectations aren't met. You'll need to have higher cash reserves for paying subcontractors promptly. You'll constantly be fighting against tricks. Check out my video on the dirty contractor tricks. You will have to put in the effort to learn the business and personally improve. Stage 4, the vacationer. Unfortunately for me, this is where my story began. Rewind it if you need to. I thought that I could just go hire any GC and they would know exactly what I wanted, how to achieve it, and they would do it in the most price-effective way possible. Man, what a sucker. What a sucker. What a sucker. What a sucker. What is it? The vacationer hires a general contractor to do all of the work. He or she may give that GC a scope of work or even have them make one on their own. The vacationer deals with the GC and only the GC. They buy a house, agree with the GC on a price, a timeline, a pay schedule, and then they wait for the project to be done while they're sipping Mai Tais. The vacationer is looking for a truly passive project. Who are these people? Well, the vacationer is usually one of two types. One is a beginner who doesn't really know enough about construction to be effective. Or they're a super advanced investor who has made their money in the game, understands the game, and they're willing to take a little bit less profit for a more passive project. Pros: most of your bandwidth will be reserved. You can be totally absent. Your project count will only be limited by your resources, like having enough deals, available GCs, and cash. The cons: your profits will be minimized and your expenses will be the highest. A bad GC will wreck your project and cause you even bigger headaches and expenses. You'll constantly be at war with budgets and timelines. You will have to work to find the best GCs by working with a lot of bad ones first. What level should you be? The final project I did back in the old days was a project that went terribly wrong for a multitude of reasons, but it all led me back to square one, finishing that project with my own two hands. I was out of money, and I knew that finishing the project would only get me back to $0, but at least I could clear all my debts. This was basically my prison sentence. I would go to that job site every day and think about what an idiot I was and all the things that I did wrong. I backed myself in a corner with my own greed. I kept wanting to do bigger and bigger projects, and all it did was brought me more and more problems. And at the end of all of it, I was worse off than when I started years before. But after I licked my wounds and played the woe is me game, I started to think about how I could do things better. And I zoomed out to take a look at my life and what I really wanted in real estate. And it wasn't to buy expensive things and sit at the head of the table of the group of advisors I had collected. My goal was to set up a business that could provide for me and my family indefinitely. It was to set up a moat around the better life that I wanted to create. With that goal in mind, I came up with a rehabbing strategy that works for me. It's the same one that I'm trying to teach you. So what is that strategy? Basically, there are three building blocks. One are specific job subs. These are guys that do big jobs like roofing, or just siding, or just windows, or electrical, or plumbing, or mechanical. And then I have what I call all-arounders. And these guys are one guy or a small crew that really does everything. They can do any of the finishes like trim or hanging cabinets, tile. They'll do the flooring, they'll do the paint. They'll do the demo and the clean out if you ask them to. And then there's the handyman. These guys are the ultimate problem solver. And so we keep a depth chart of the best handyman, or you bring a crew in of your own that does nothing but problem solve. So I always think of these guys as the bottleneck breakers. They're the ones that are gonna fill the gaps that are in between number 1 and 2, the specific job guy and the all-arounder. So when a problem comes up, I send them out to break the bottleneck, and then I can get an all-arounder or a specific job subcontractor out there. I'm always focused on deepening the depth chart of these contractors. And really, I'm focused on the all-arounders. These guys really make these projects happen. They create cost efficiencies. You can put them on a project. They'll basically do any of it, and they don't mind the types of rehabs that we're doing if you find the right ones. And then there's the specific job guys. They're easier to find typically because they focus on one thing and they're usually marketing themselves for that one thing. But these guys are really good for full replacements. So if I have to do a roof or siding on a house, or if I have to do new windows, which is rare, mechanical, electrical, plumbing are obvious examples, and drywall. Usually these guys are way more efficient than an all-arounder at doing drywall, at least if you have to do a full house of drywall. And then there's the handyman. And for the handyman, at this point in my career, these guys are actually an internal crew of the ultimate problem solvers. But before I had my own crew, I would just find any handyman company out there. In fact, every handyman company out there. And I would just keep calling until I got the best one on my speed dial. And you know, that's what you really have to do because you need these guys that can break the bottleneck. I mean, in a nutshell, this is exactly how we manage all of our projects. And this works if you're a smaller investor doing 1 to 4 projects at a time, or if you're a bigger investor doing 20 to 30 projects at a time. You just have to deepen the depth chart the more projects you're doing. Now, for some of our projects, we still go out and hire a GC to totally take it over. It's a less profitable method for us, but it allows us to free up some bandwidth to focus on what we really want to focus on. And it's just like managing any subcontractor at that point. You set up a pay schedule and pay and check their work at different checkpoints. We call those checkpoints phases. You got to take it slow. Don't start out by trying to go too big. Your first goal is don't lose your butt. And then over time, you'll gain the skills and experience necessary to really understand what level you're at and how the things that you're doing fit into your big picture plan. So take it easy out there, and good luck, investors.